Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
And as has been pointed out by both Nehru and many commentators, India is the country that had the first elected communist government in Kerala. And American political scientists said at that time it would have been unthinkable in America that anybody, a communist, could possibly have formed a government anywhere in the United States, the most democratic country as they always imagined themselves to be. But it was in India that it happened first. So he was very convinced about the strength of Indian democracy, and after Indian independence, it seemed to justify itself. Democracy was entrenched, the 3 general elections were conducted, and the world was very impressed, and so was he, that democracy had really instituted itself.
Nehru presented himself as a liberal and a socialist. Yet while he did not explicitly identify as a conservative, he frequently employed Burkean and traditionalist arguments to legitimize Indian democracy. At the same time, he repeatedly warned that democracy risked self-destruction through the emergence of a democratic dictatorship or the tyranny of the majority. In this episode, Secretary of the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund and editor of the forthcoming comprehensive online edition of the Nehru Archives, Madhavan K. Palat, explores the complex and often paradoxical dimensions of Nehru's engagements with democracy. This episode was adapted from an event that took place at the Bangalore International Centre in January of 2025.
Nehru's democracy, as we all know, Nehru presented himself as a Democrat, a liberal, social democrat, and socialist. He said he was both social democrat and socialist. Now, it's interesting that he should have done so. And we always use the words almost interchangeably, and I think Nehru also did. But it is of interest to note that the word socialist is used in the Romance languages in Europe and social democrat in the Teutonic languages. Britain, of course, stands out as an exception as usual and says Labour, but they mean socialist. And I think Nehru called himself most often socialist, that's how we understand it. But they mean practically the same. But democracy was the primary drive within him. He treated it as a value in itself and as an instrument to consolidate Indian independence and unity. It is one of those marvelous examples of Nehru's instinct and strategy coinciding and forming a very powerful motivation for action. So he could never be purely, or could not ever be opportunist and purely instrumentalist. His conviction and his strategy making went together. They coincided, which doesn't happen most often with politicians, but in his case, he managed to do the two together. But he found a major problem in democracy. Democracy is always understood as a rule of the majority, minimally. That is the starting point. It need not be that entirely. And he found that it is always threatened by the tyranny of majorities and a possible dictatorship also. The two are distinct. The tyranny of majorities, of course, is where a situation you have of one community is a majority and the rest are doomed to servitude under that community. We know the situation only too well. And in the major democracies of the world, we have that situation. In America, racism condemns the African American to a subordinate status, and we know all the consequences of that. Israel calls itself a democracy, but with distinct apartheid for the Arab population there. And South Africa was lately an apartheid country in the same fashion. They thought of themselves as a democracy in this way. There are many other places which are of the same kind, many other parts of the world, which are democracies but have an excluded population. So that is one problem of the tyranny of the majority, which is only too well known. But democracy is a way of establishing a dictatorship, and no better way than democracy to have a dictatorship, ironic as that might seem. Far superior to military rule or any other or inherited rule, certainly, because you have the sanction of the majority of the population, and that gives you a level of strength and legitimacy which none can gainsay under any circumstance. And that has led to so many dictatorships around the world, which go by in the 19th century, they went by names like Bonapartism and Caesarism and so on. Bonapartism was a favored word amongst Marxists. Caesarism was a favored word amongst the conservatives. But anyway, there's the same phenomenon. That means an elected dictator. And it culminated in the 20th century in fascism and its extreme phenomenon of National Socialism, where all were dictatorships elected and constitutionally legitimated. Hitler being the extreme case, where through a very democratic constitution as the Weimar Republic, he became the dictator, the Führer, and the Constitution of the Weimar Republic continued in operation all the way into 1945. So Hitler was actually ruling with an extremely democratic constitution, something that should make us all beware of constitutions guaranteeing democracies. However good the constitution, you can never be sure about it. Something that we'll have to discuss in a moment, and Nehru was only too aware of this problem. Now, what were Nehru's justifications for committing himself to democracy? The point is he had to justify it also. It is not automatic in any way. Whichever ideological or strategic choice he made, he always justified it in one way or the other. He did not treat it as merely desirable, which of course it was, but many people stop at pursuing a cause that is desirable and do not consider how to make it possible. Nehru thought it was and argued that it was entirely possible because it historically made possible. And this is the strength of the argument. All the virtues of democracy, he has said, are already present in India. So in Indian politics will have to be democratic when India becomes independent. Indeed, it is already democratic in the 1920s and 30s. What he meant was that from the 1870s, India had been mobilizing public opinion and arguing extremely on a democratic platform constantly for the future of India, one way or the other. And so a vast amount of democratic public opinion had been mobilized throughout India all the way until the First World War. And then with the coming of Mahatma Gandhi and his mobilization of a mass movement, it became even more so. So Indian politics was extremely democratic. Of course, its opponent was the antithesis of democracy. Therefore, India had a tradition of democracy already, and it was entirely created in India by Indians, not a gift of the colonial Raj, not a gift of Europe, as they always like to make it out to be. It is a product of Indian politics itself, the experience of it. It is not the product of constitutional regimes and constitutional concessions that the Raj was making from the early 20th century onward, culminating supposedly in 1947. Nothing of the kind. It was built up by Indian politics against the Raj. The Raj was an example of a dictatorship, and Indian politics, or the nationalist politics, was democratic. So the democracy was shaped in the struggle for independence, and that is how it was so profoundly and utterly Indian. Historically, from the 1870s, in its contest with the Raj, it defined itself more and more democratically, inclusive in every respect, including every possible opinion within it, and every lobby had a free run in expressing itself and taking up a platform within what is called the national movement, which is a huge umbrella of all kinds of movements from the left to the right, including the communal right, were all included within it. The Hindu Mahasabha and even the Muslim League at one time, as you know, was within it. So it had become a firm Indian tradition, in fact, of modern times. It has nothing to do with the Raj. On top of that, he added one more justification, which is not quite so particularly strong, but it is as strong as anybody else who claims an ancient tradition. He claimed that the Panchayats were an ancient tradition of democracy within India, and it has lasted for at least until medieval times, and it had faded away only in colonial times. So India had an ancient tradition. Now, of course, this is, I know, dubious historically, nothing of the kind. Those village councils called Panchayats, you cannot consider them democracies. They're just oligarchies of the upper castes and local nobility there. But that is the same level of argument that everywhere in the world where they claimed traditional democracy. be it the British or the Germans or the perpetrators, or the ones who began it as romantic theorists. And it extended on both sides of the continent, as far as Britain, with the Saxon Moots and so on, into Russia, with the famous Obshchina, all of them claiming democratic structures of great antiquity. All very dubious argument, but nonetheless used significantly for romantic purposes and for legitimizing their democratic movements in due course. And Nehru was doing almost the same as all the European movements of the 19th century were. So it was, further he said, India was untainted with any empire. All the democracies of Europe and America, he pointed out, were democratic at home and imperialist abroad. So it was the antithesis of democracy that they promoted abroad in every sense. So what India experienced of their democracies was in fact a colonial dictatorship. That kind of a dichotomy did not exist in the Indian political tradition. He did not say that, but he did not use these words as yet. India had not yet become imperial. So India was free of that particular taint of being both democratic at home and imperialist abroad. So all the way it could go into a properly democratic system. And as has been pointed out by both Nehru and many commentators, India is the country that had the first elected communist government in Kerala. And American political scientists said, at that time it would have been unthinkable in America that anybody, a communist, could possibly have formed a government anywhere in the United States, the most democratic country, as they always imagined themselves to be. But it was in India that it happened first. So he was very convinced about the strength of Indian democracy, and after Indian independence, it seemed to justify itself. Democracy was entrenched, the 3 general elections were conducted, and the world was very impressed, and so was he, that democracy had really instituted itself. But the problem that he now had to think about, once democracy had been established, is how do you ensure that it will remain vibrant? As long as there's a movement, it is vibrant. But you cannot have only movements. It has to stabilize itself through institutions and constitutions. And once that happens, what is likely to happen? The trouble with constitutions, or rather institutions, is that they become stagnant, stable, conservative. They do not wish to change. All the marvels of bureaucracy take over. Bureaucracy is precisely that. They apply the rules constantly and they do not wish to change. On the other hand, democracy is disruptive. It wants to change. It is constantly mobilizing movements and seeking to transform. So he was acutely conscious of that this conflict is going to take place, and he was seeing it taking place throughout his tenure. On the one hand, there are democratic thrusts taking place from below, and there is, on the other hand, there's a bureaucratic maintenance of stability and order. Both are essential for any society to be stable, for a state to function, and for all of us to have a predictable existence. Bureaucracy is essential. And strangely enough, therefore, bureaucracy and democracy actually go together. The more you have bureaucracy, the more you can have democracy. Or rather, the more you have democracy, the more you can have you need bureaucracy to make it stable, though it may not happen necessarily the other way around. And when we examine the history of 19th century Europe, as the democratic experiments kept on developing, the bureaucracies multiplied and made it more and more effective in one way or the other. And that is what would happen here. But when they come into conflict, and when he finds that at any time that democracy is being hindered by bureaucracy, his answer was not to have more of bureaucracy, not to have better rules and regulations and better institutions. No. His answer was always more of democracy. The solution to a democratic problem is to have more democracy. Democracy will solve democratic problems, not bureaucracy. That would be the answer always. He would mobilize more support. He would go deeper into the Indian population. He would seek out more opinions. All the time, he would seek a democratic solution to a problem of democracy being perverted, hindered, or in any way stymied. And one of the ways he always did so was, that's one reason why, if you remember from Nehru's biography, he was always addressing public audiences. He was a great lover of public speaking. he always wanted to know what the people were thinking. Now, the problem, of course, that the people do not speak back to you. He's speaking to them. And how did he know? He looked into their faces. Again and again, he writes in his various diaries and speeches and so on, I looked into the faces of the people in front of me and I saw their problems. It is a peculiarly Dostoevskian vision. You look into the icon of the Virgin Mary and of Jesus Christ, and you see the spirituality and the salvation that is ahead of you. In the same way, he looked into the faces of the people of India in all his public speeches, and he saw answers. It came to him that way. So it was through more democratic communication and experimentation that he solved the institutional problems of democracy. He did not think of having more bureaucracy, more rules, more regulations, not having a CBI, then a CVC, then a etc., one after the other, ED and so on, to solve more and more problems. That is not how it will happen. The major stabilization force, of course, was the Constitution. How was it to be created, and what was his notion of what a constitution is to play, the role that it is to play in India, in the future India? The first step to institutionalizing democracy was to have an ideal constitution. And for it to be ideal, it had to be created by the people of India in its entirety. All the people, by adult suffrage, would elect a Constituent Assembly, which would then deliberate seriously, rationally, calmly, and produce the ideal constitution on the basis of which the future of India will, the future state, government and society of India will be governed. Ideal visions, but none of it actually occurred. His first condition was that the British should have no role in it. It has to be Indian after all. The constitution should not come as a gift from the British under any circumstances. There are many places in the British colonies which had their constitutions written for them in London and handed over to them. Sri Lanka is one of them. Ivor Jennings wrote it for Sri Lanka. And so on, many other places. But nothing of the sort. He said the one thing that cannot happen is the British producing a constitution or even legitimizing it or permitting it or any such thing. We will do it ourselves. Because the one thing that the British were adept at under any circumstance was to divide. And it'll create constitutions or create conditions which will create more and more divisions. That is the experience he had in the 1940s, I mean, right through 1920s onward. But it was exacerbated in the 1930s and 40s. And it reached its paroxysm in 1947, as the story you know only too well. So he constantly campaigned for precisely that. But he was disappointed. As it happened, when the Constituent Assembly was ordered, it was by the British government. In September 1945, they ordered the election of the provincial and central legislatures in India, which will be the electorate for the Constituent Assembly. So it was a British law, under British terms, under a franchise which is absurd, which only 28.5% of the population was to vote in these elections, which are going to produce the Constituent Assembly that will determine the future of India. So he was extremely disappointed about it, that this should happen. And of all people, the princes had a role in it, something that he considered completely obnoxious and absurd in every way. It was not an Indian creation, finally. It was a creation of the colonial regime. And as for adult suffrage, he had set great store by that. He had an absolute faith in the masses. The masses just cannot be wrong. The people cannot be wrong. He never said masses. He said the people. The people cannot be wrong. And he had a faith in them in the manner of the French revolutionary assemblies and French revolutionary politics of the 1790s. And like the historian Jules Michelet, he thought that everything is done by the people. And once the people have spoken, it cannot go wrong. That is what democracy will be all about. And he expected a huge surge in power through such mobilization, which will legitimize his power and all the actions that he used to carry out. Now, once again, the instinct of the Democrat and the calculating strategy of the politician fused into one here. The adult suffrage was something that was anathema to everybody, every one of his opponents. Adult suffrage wiped out the colonial establishment because they just could not mobilize the population. They depended upon repression and manipulative politics, nothing else. They could not possibly mobilize any part of the Indian population because then at once they'll have to become nationalist and welfare-oriented, neither of which, of course, they could ever be. Namely, they'll cease to be colonial. So the Raj was out. The Muslim League was even more terrified of it because they would lose the capacity of manipulating the British state through their presence in these legislative assemblies. Once you open it to the masses, they do not know how far it will go and whether they will win the vote at all. The same problem for the Hindu Mahasabha. So his two communal opponents and his colonial opponent all detested the adult suffrage. And they made all sorts of excuses, saying that it is dangerous. You are unleashing all sorts of dangerous forces. You never know where it will go. Finally, the left were comfortable, obviously, with the adult suffrage. But they had one problem. Nehru saw he would be outwitting them by adult suffrage. According to him, the revolutions in the 19th century and in the 20th century were due to the fact that there was no adult suffrage. The people did not have the vote, and therefore they had to turn to revolution to overthrow the existing state in each case. All the revolutionary politics of the 19th century in Europe seem to justify that, and certainly of the Russian revolutionary politics of the 20th century. So it was a consistent refrain throughout his years that there cannot be any revolutionary politics if you have adult suffrage. You will have an evolutionary politics, and you can have socialism by evolutionary choice. Because the people are involved in their government, the government represents them. It is not something that is imposed upon them. Therefore, adult suffrage is actually the solution to revolutionary politics and all the mayhem that revolution causes. And revolution divides society in such an extreme fashion that you'll never overcome the hatreds and bitterness that it causes. And Russia is a spectacular example of precisely that. So, the left, as he saw it, were denied their revolution by virtue of having an adult suffrage. So they were also eliminated or marginalized. In every way, it left him on the stage, center stage, and in control. Now, through this, he then committed himself and drew all the lessons of evolutionary politics that the Fabian socialists and the German Social Democrats, especially led by Edward Bernstein, who was effectively a Fabian, had constructed. And Nehru's socialism was of the Fabian type. He imagined evolutionary socialism was possible on this basis, precisely because you have adult suffrage and all that comes with it. Now, of course, many people did argue to him, and generally in public, that with mass illiteracy and incredible poverty as in India, you cannot afford to have adult suffrage. He dismissed that question out of hand. He said that is a silly objection made by people who are enjoying the wealth and privileges of being an elite. For the good reason, he said that mass education and total literacy did not save Germany from Hitler. So being uneducated doesn't necessarily deprive you of a democratic capacity. Secondly, the Gandhian politics actually mobilized the population around a very rational, mass, and controlled politics. Satyagraha is a great degree of control that he managed to impose, a discipline he managed to impose upon all the following, and the rationality of it, in fact, rescued India from the horrors of many of these revolutionary movements that has destroyed so much of East Europe. Now, if that is possible, then why do we say that mass illiteracy is any kind of a hurdle? He said, no, go straight ahead. We'll have adult suffrage and we'll carry the day. And in this, he was amply justified. From the very first general election, we've had universal suffrage, and Indian democracy and all its institutions have been based upon that. And nobody has ever suggested that that should be in any way be diminished. So deeply involved, so profoundly committed was he that he constantly burst into poetic flights. And one of those I must recite to you. It was pure Omar Khayyam in a Fitzgeraldian strain. He talked about the peasant who, having received so much from the Gandhian politics and mobilization and the rights, he said, his sunken eyes glistened and his shrunken, starved body rose up in enthusiasm, and the wine of hope filled his veins. pure Fitzgerald, mediating Omar Khayyam. But as I said, he was cruelly disappointed once again, because the assembly was elected on a 28.5% suffrage base. And all the major parties were excluded. The Muslim League, first of all, boycotted. The Communist Party, the same, followed by the socialists, who were rather obstreperous and insisted that this is a British creation, so why should we? And there they had the support of all people, Gandhi, who said, it's no use saying that somebody else's creation is a sovereign body. That is, a British creation is not a sovereign body. So Nehru was hit from all sides in this respect. And of course, the Hindu Mahasabha was also out. And instead you had the princes coming in, sending their nominees, not by election by any means. So it was the worst of all. But the Congress, it became finally a Congress-dominated assembly. He sought to resolve the problem by having as wide a representation from within the Congress as possible of all the interests. That much they did try. But it was ultimately a Constituent Assembly that was undemocratic, unrepresentative, and the product of the colonial state. But the good thing is it produced an excellent constitution, and it retained adult suffrage, which continued into the election system thereafter. So its promise was indeed redeemed. Nehru had one big problem about the legitimacy of what is coming from here. He never expressed it directly, as many others did. Many others in the Constituent Assembly said, in what way is this constitution superior to the new parliaments that are going to come? After all, they are going to be elected on universal suffrage. This is elected on such a limited suffrage. They will have all the parties represented there. This has none of the parties except the Congress. So why is the Constituent Assembly and its constitution considered superior to what is going to come from them? Yes, that hurt him deeply. It cut him to the quick. So when he proposed the Aims and Objects resolution in January 1946, he said, our objective is to create an independent sovereign republic, nothing more. No democratic, no secular. He was asked, why aren't you using the word democratic? Why aren't you calling it a democratic republic? And he answered, the word democracy is implied in the word republic. Now, this is a barefaced pretense. He knew history only too well. He's written those histories. The Roman Republic was anything but democratic. And the Soviet Union was a republic also. And the Soviet Union's totalitarianism is not what he considered a model of democracy. But he said he did not want divisive terms. My feeling is that he felt that the Constituent Assembly was not sufficiently democratic for him to be able to use the term with the confidence that it was required. But ultimately, when the Constitution itself was drafted, the preamble says, sovereign democratic republic. That's how India is defined. His own words were, in the Aims and Objects resolution, independent sovereign republic. That is the core of it. But finally, it came in. And therefore, he ultimately considered the Constituent Assembly as a body that was at best registering a certain degree of opinion. It is not the revolutionary body that he expected it to be. And therefore, he saw the constitution also that it produced as merely a product of this kind of a body, and the democracy that India was to have would be the guarantor of the constitution. The constitution would not guarantee democracy. So always it would be democratic politics that would preserve our constitution, not the other way around. So much of our jurisprudence and so much of our politics revolves around the discussion about whether the constitution is being preserved or not, and whether it's being violated in whatever way. Nehru would have and did put his emphasis on the nature of the politics of the country. And only that politics would save the constitution. Of course, it's important to have the constitution, but you need to pay attention to the nature of the politics. And by going on fiddling with more and more laws, you're not going to get a better politics. You're not going to get a better democracy. That was his position. However, he need not have been so pessimistic, and he was somewhat fantasizing that he would have a revolutionary body that would create the ideal constitution of the kind he had in mind. The trouble is, if he knew his history, and he should have remembered through his historical examples, that all constitutions or all constituent assemblies are the products of a previous regime, and therefore of a regime that is to be superseded, of a regime, therefore, that is to be illegitimate as far as the Constitution is concerned. The Constitution is not self-created totally. The assembly that produces the Constitution is summoned by a previous regime. Somebody has to organize the elections and establish the suffrage and provide the rules and so on. And in every case, all constitutions have been drawn up by an assembly which was summoned by a previous regime, which had to be overthrown or superseded. And the most famous of all was the Third Estate in French revolutionary politics in 1789, as you know, that simply declared itself the Constituent Assembly and produced a constitution. The Third Estate had been summoned by the king, none less. And it had not been summoned for the purpose of framing a constitution. It had been summoned for something else altogether, really to help the king get some money. That's all. So if that can be accepted, everything else can be. So, and to further the argument, though Nehru had not come to quite such an extreme position, Carl Schmitt, the German jurist who was so close to the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s, argued most acutely that in fact all constitutions and constituent assemblies were not democratic bodies by any means. They were dictatorships. Constituent assemblies, after all, are responsible only to themselves. They establish their own norms. They draft the constitution according to their discretion, and they dissolve themselves. Therefore, they are utterly dictatorial. They're not answerable to anybody. And having done their job, they dissolve themselves. So they're not democratic at all. They are naturally dictatorships. And it is to these dictatorships that we owe our most democratic constitutions. So the idea that you can have a perfectly democratic body producing a democratic constitution, therefore, is completely misplaced. And Nehru was making a mistake, as it were, in that sense. Not that he read Carl Schmitt, I don't think, because Schmitt had not been translated. But there are enough examples of that kind of argument already in the jurisprudence that is available to him to read about. He was aware of something else, of British parliamentary politics and British parliamentary legal philosophy, which was that people like Leslie Stephen and Dicey had argued that the sovereignty of Parliament was such that they could legislate any law, whatsoever it be, and it had to be enforced. That is, they were a dictatorship in themselves. This is a British Parliament, which is meant to be the mother of all democracies. Now, the point was, and here Leslie Stephen made the argument, and Dicey followed him. He said, if Parliament passed a law saying that all babies born with blue eyes have to be slaughtered, it is not only completely constitutional, completely valid in every sense, the civil service would have to carry it out. Then it cannot stop it. And then he asked the question, well, how do you prevent such an atrocity? Is it likely to happen? And he said it is not likely to happen because Parliament would have to go collectively mad to pass such a law. And secondly, there would be a revolution of some kind, there'd be revolt to prevent that happening. In other words, Dicey was arguing there'll have to be a democratic revolution to prevent it. Democracy will not allow such a thing to happen. Democracy would supersede the dictatorship of the British Constitution and of British Parliament in such a case. That is the point he was making. And this is what Nehru was only too well aware of. How you can have all these kinds of laws passed, but there'll always be a democratic constraint upon it. And it is only by democracy that you can actually stop stop it happening. And for that reason, it is not the Constitution that he turned to when he considered the problem of American racism, of Jim Crow laws, of segregation, and so on. It is the nature of American politics that permits such a thing to happen, not the Constitution itself. And again, this same problem occurred. So he need not have been so very anxious. In fact, in 1936, Stalin introduced universal suffrage, in the universal and equal suffrage in the Soviet constitution. As you perhaps know, the earlier constitution did not have equal suffrage. It had only universal. Workers were given 5 times the number of votes as the peasants were. In 1936, it was equalized. But the product was not the democracy that he had in mind. It was something that he would not have cared to consider a democracy at all. And the example of Hitler I've already considered. Now, once the Constitution is made for a democratic purpose, as well as for a revolutionary purpose of transforming Indian society, he had to answer to himself the major question. How do you ensure both stability and change through a constitution? Both of them are required. You need it. It's a central problem for all political leaders. You need constant change. You need stability also. How do you ensure both? Nehru's tendency was always that the constitution cannot be considered sacrosanct. It should not degenerate into becoming the Holy Writ. It should not become the equivalent of the Vedas or the Bible or the Quran or any one of these things. And you cannot have a series of professorial constitutional experts arguing like priests about the nature of each article of the Constitution. That is not which will defend Indian democracy or protect it in any way. It will have to be, as I said earlier, the democratic politics. And he's always worried that there's a tendency, of course, to inflexibility. He was particularly concerned not only that he had to carry out a social revolution, especially over the land tenures and so on, about which we know only too much, but that one generation should not prescribe for future generations what their politics is to be. So it was his opportunity, it was given to him to create a constitution. The next generation should have the same freedom to produce, if not another constitution, but to alter it accordingly. Therefore, he was in favor of easy amendment. The whole argument has come down to the question of how easily can you amend the constitution, and so on. And that brings us to the question of basic structure. He wanted the constitution because he imagined there should be something permanent about it to provide the stability. But he never defined what was the permanence about it, what was to be permanent, what are the features that were to be permanent. This is what has been called basic structure in our jurisprudence. But he stood for easy amendment. He almost thought of Parliament as a constituent body, right through. Exactly as the Constituent Assembly had created the Constitution, Parliament can continue to do so. But he was overruled, and effectively a series of more complicated rules were created for the amendment of the Constitution. But his preference was for easy amendment. Only that will allow flexibility, and that will allow future generations to express themselves through the Constitution. But now the big question, did Nehru have any idea of a basic structure, any concept of a basic structure, which has come to occupy a very large part in our consciousness about our Constitution today? The answer would be both yes and no. His idea of a basic structure was the independent sovereign republic. If you put all his speeches together and all his other utterances, this is where the core of it lies. The independent sovereign republic, which cannot be in any way compromised. Indian independence should never be lost in any way or diluted. It should always remain a republic, and that's it. That is what he considered the core, which will never be in any way damaged. The rest were subject to alteration, according to the wisdom of the people of the country. His reasoning was that rights could be abridged. but restored. But independence once lost or even partially reduced may not be recovered. So your focus has to be always on independence and on the unity of the country, which is the other aspect of it, the sovereignty of it, even if fundamental rights and so on may be abridged at times. And he's the one, as you know, who actually amended the Constitution almost immediately after the Constitution was brought into effect. This might explain why he also did not include the word democratic in it. That is not necessary. It is all assumed to be taking place. It will come along with it. But he did have there was a logic of having a concept of a basic structure. The trouble is the concept did not evolve during his lifetime. He himself did not have the time to develop it. And it emerged finally only in the 1970s, long after he died. But if I were to say what was the thrust of Nehru's argumentation, here I do not have direct textual support. I'm only making an argument about the implied meaning of Nehru's own arguments. It is that the basic structure is to be found not in particular utterances of the various articles of the Constitution, but in the totality of it, or the whole of the Constitution taken together, and to consider it as a single document where you assess and discover what is the structure to it. So it has to be separately argued. It cannot be just found in particular articles of the Constitution. I think this is a point that has been made very well by Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Vice Chancellor here, and I have profited much from reading his work on the subject, and I do not make any pretense to originality on analyzing this point. But when it came to listing what the actual items of the basic structure are, when Soli Sorabji listed them and Krishnaswamy accepted them as saying that there is virtual unanimity of it, the items were secularism, democracy, the rule of law, federalism, and an independent judiciary and judicial review. I think this listing, which we would be perfectly happy with, he would not have been happy with, because it did not mention the independence and the sovereignty of the Republic, which he considered the core of the whole Constitution. He was not troubled about where sovereignty lay, because it was in the people, very clearly. It did not lie anywhere else. The problem was, how was the power of sovereignty of the sovereign to be institutionally exercised? Who would be exercising it? In his mind, it was the elected representatives of the people. If the people are the sovereign, their elected representatives would be the ones who would exercise it. Therefore, Parliament and the legislatures, the state legislatures. But he was also aware that that's not adequate, because they did not really represent the entire population. And most often they were minorities that were deciding. The governments were elected minorities more often than majorities. And it is not satisfactory to claim that because they had a certain majority position in the legislature, therefore they represented the majority of the population, or even the whole population. He was aware of that problem. But he did not formulate it in terms of who was exercising the sovereignty of India, or where does sovereignty lie. That was not the problem. And whether sovereignty is to be shared, which is a further discussion in this particular discussion about basic structure. As you know, when the judiciary made statements about the basic structure, there are howls of protest from parliaments and legislatures and others, saying the judiciary is claiming the sovereign powers of parliament. It's not that parliament has sovereign powers any more than the judiciary has. Sovereign powers always rest with the people. It's the exercise of those powers and how the powers are divided and how they're institutionally distributed that is the question. Now, it's not distributed only between these two arms of the state, the legislatures and the judiciary. That's not how he would have seen it, although many jurists see it that way today. There was a dispersion of power, he would have argued, and did argue at different times. But it was a dispersion between the legislatures, the judiciary, academic jurists and experts, a lay public opinion, a free press, and anybody else. All are contributing to the exercise of the power of the sovereign. It's not only these two institutions. So it's not the discourse of the separation of powers does not help us in this matter as far as Nehru is concerned. He saw it as a much more widely based and more widely exercised than just the legislatures and the judiciaries, however important their roles might be. But that is the extent to which, that's as far as his reflections on the basic structure went. He did not elaborate, and I'm just implying that this is how far it would have gone. Now, but for him to complete the nature of the democracy in the country, he based it. He saw that the democracy is secure only if it has a very wide base, and that wide base would be provided by the Panchayats. Already there's parliaments and the legislatures. The Panchayats would provide the foundation of it. And democracy would stand as securely as a pyramid because only when that base is so wide as it is. And he was a great enthusiast of Panchayats, but not only Panchayats. Along with the Panchayats, the cooperative movement, village industries, village schools, all the village level development was part of the totality of the Panchayat scheme. The Panchayat was merely the elected part of it. And he saw it as extending democracy right down to the base. But there's great ambiguity here, which is that he saw the Panchayats not only as democratic representatives of the people at the bottom and expressing their wishes as to what is required at that level, but also as the ones that implemented the planning requirements of the state above them, and therefore as an extension of the bureaucracy. So he saw the Panchayat as a point where both democracy and bureaucracy merged. There were bureaucrats at the lowest level, there were Democrats also at that level. They were like the parliament, but at the village, and they were like district officers, but again at the village. And it is their responsibility to carry out the developmental plans of the government in every way. So he saw them as extensions in this way, bureaucratically and democratically. At every time, he would use the language of a superior granting powers. Now, a democracy is never created by granting it. Democracies are created by assertions from below. And that is the history of the national movement in India, and he should know all about it. But what he saw is that it is now being granted from above by him somewhat as an imperial boon to the people at the bottom. And he kept on haranguing them, saying, do not look to us for support, you must go and do it yourself. A sort of paternalist haranguing of the people well below, at the bottom of the pyramid in every case. Finally, it became a sort of NGO. That's how he saw it happening. They were engaged in all the local developmental activities through all these networks, and it would have his imprimatur at every point, and it will be democracy constructed downward. So it is very ambiguous. It is democratic, at the same time not democratic. It is distinctly bureaucratic. And the way he thought about it, and finally the product that came, is not very different from what many states have been doing throughout history in various kingdoms and empires. The central bureaucracy always had a problem about how to deal with village administration. And their standard procedure was to get the village to elect their officials, who would then be answerable to the central bureaucracy. So the village would elect a bureaucracy to represent the village to the center and carry out the wishes of the center. So having elected village council did not mean necessarily bureaucracy. It meant an extension of the imperial bureaucracy throughout history. And in some senses, the Panchayats were doing precisely that. in Nehru's mind. His inspirations were multiple in every way. He saw it as opening up many democratic spaces, and it did, but it was, as I said, many other. His inspirations were Gandhian, Fabian, Soviet. It went back and back in the socialist tradition to Herzen, Fourier, and Owen, and all those. And it even went into purely conservative particularism, as when he encouraged Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay to develop all the village crafts and industries. The village crafts were particular to the village. They were to nurture the tradition that was handed down from immemorial times, and to allow the creativity of the villager to come out as they as it had been nurtured over the centuries. Now, that form of local particularism through village guilds actually is the kind that was fostered by conservative movements in Europe for developing a local particularism in every way, which is one reason why both in the Soviet Union and in China after the revolutions, precisely those forms of local particularisms were wiped out. And they were merged into the respective revolutionary bureaucracies thereafter. But in India, it has been a highly successful, very creative, but the impulse was conservative. So Nehru provided a marvelous amalgam, a very rich amalgam of everything that was Gandhian and socialist and conservative and liberal. It came together through these kinds of movements. Their ambiguities helped. And Nehru was a person who always said he despised theory. It didn't matter to him whether something was conservative or liberal or Gandhian. The point is it produced a certain result, which is good. And therefore, it was very pragmatically effective. And having despised theoreticians always, or theorists, he saw it as enabling the active citizen through the Panchayat. But and now his elements of doubts creep in. Electoral politics. The heart of democracy was electoral politics at all stages. And this was an area that was of darkness and dismay to him. He saw it as a source of venality, corruption, and everything that was the opposite of everything that he stood for. People did not live for ideals. They did not work for ideals. They were really buying each other, buying votes and striking deals. And this is what he deplored from the very first election. In fact, from 1937 itself, when the 1935 Act was enforced. He found elections was a corrupt process, in fact, all the way. So a Democrat though he was, he deplored how rotten it was in so many senses. But of course, that is the fate of democracy. There's a long critique of democracy as being the product of competition between elites and nothing more than that. And he was discovering the reality of it when Indian democracy actually took off. He found that actually there were not political leaders who were presenting their opinions before a public and arriving at conclusions after a rational discussion and debate with their colleagues. No, they were striking deals behind closed doors. And the deals having been struck, they came to Parliament or the legislature and voted. So everything was fixed beforehand. There was nothing, the debates are all meaningless in this sense, and the whole process was utterly despicable and corrupt as far as he was concerned. And as democracy was established and the Indian Republic took off in the 1950s, he was more and more disillusioned with the result. His was an experience that is familiar to all those who have seen a revolution take place and then sees what comes after the revolution. Inevitably, everybody is in despair. You know the story of Lenin and his despair, and he was actually planning a coup against Stalin, in fact, because of precisely that. And that happens with many others, again and again throughout history, and it certainly happened in his case. And equally the fears that there would be a democracy only produces, these kinds of democratic politics produces only an elective aristocracy and nothing more than that. And this is already a well-established critique in Europe by then, where trade unions and party members and ministers all struck deals amongst each other at the expense of their respective followings. And the trade unions, in fact, had become another bureaucracy. Sidney and Beatrice Webb actually called them civil servants because they passed exams to become trade union leaders. So this is noted by all the scholars of trade unions and electoral politics in Germany and Italy and so on, not only France, not only Britain. The one point I should note here to you is he was criticized all the time for creating a one-party dictatorship. And he had fears himself that a one-party dictatorship might be looming in the near future. It is strange for him to complain that he was winning elections too often. It is something like a capitalist complaining about monopolies that he was enjoying and deriving his profits from it. But it was always his experience that there didn't seem to be an adequate opposition to him for him to sharpen his teeth against. And he considered the two-party system to be the only stable democratic system that is viable. So as long as there's only one party, there was something wrong with it. So he considered the Congress domination as something defective in our democratic politics. He tried to get round of it by saying, actually, I've got an opposition within the party, not outside it. So I'm doing not too badly. But this was a situation where he was caught between a movement and an institution. He was always in favor of a movement. Therefore, he included everybody under his umbrella. Therefore, it became one party. So when he said the opposition was there, they were all the people who had been included within the movement for his democratic national politics. He was himself guilty of bringing people in. He was not divisive enough, but it provided the stability that was required in India after independence, and he did it extremely well. So it was by creating a sort of dictatorship of his own that he provided the stability, but that dictatorship was provided through a democratic politics, the very kind that he would have otherwise deplored in every way. And he is the one who actually considered that what was evolving in India was something like a party state. You know, the Soviet Union, Soviet politics was considered a party state. The Communist Party was a state, part of the state. And he contrasted it with the British one, where the party merely conducted the elections and the state got on with it after that. The party disappeared after the elections. He said India is somewhere in between the two. This is his own example. It is not by independent scholars of the Soviet Union considering this as the case. He cited the two extremes, and India is somewhere between the two. The Congress Party conducts the election, and the Congress Party after that enforces the policies of the government through planning. And that's where the Panchayats and so on came. So he saw India, the Congress and the Indian system as a partial party state, akin to the Soviet one. But nonetheless, he saw that India had if not a two-party system, at least a two-ideology system.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Saranaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.